Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar on how to re-engage your church in the mission. I'm Sean, one of the ministry consultants here at the Unstuck Group, and we're really happy that you decided to join us today because this topic is particularly important to us here at the Unstuck Group. Everything that we do to help pastors, help people meet and follow Jesus. And equipping churches to get on mission together really is at the heart of why we exist. So this is going to be a great conversation for us today. Before we get into the content, though, let me introduce our panelists. Tony Morgan is here with us today. Tony is the founder, of course, and lead strategist here at the Unstuck Group. Started the Unstuck Group back in 2009, and now our team has served around 600, just over 600 churches throughout the United States and some other countries around the world. So Tony, welcome to the webinar. And what comes to mind for you when you think about a church that's either engaged together on the mission or maybe right now, maybe misaligned or disengaged?
Yeah, I'm actually recalling a story. This was several years ago, working with a church, and they called us in around this conversation about engaging both the staff and the congregation in the mission of the church. And the reason they called us in is they were experiencing a lack of alignment. Good ministry was happening in the church, but those good ministries were pulling people in different directions. And we see this, Sean, from time to time, where ministries can be pulling in different directions, campuses can be pulling in directions. Sometimes it's generations within the church that are competing with each other. And actually, the way the pastor described it is like this. He said, "We don't have walls between us, but they're definitely chain link fences." In other words, what he was trying to communicate is we're operating in silos and we can still talk to each other, but we're not pulling together. And on the other hand, we've worked with some great churches in recent years. Crossroads Church in Denver comes to mind. The team is aligned, and because of that, the team is engaged. And now they're winning when it comes to attendance. They're winning with engagement in the church. They're winning when it comes to the culture within their staff team and within the congregation. And all of that happens when we have alignment that re-engages our church and our team on the mission.
We also have, of course, Amy Anderson here with us today. Amy is the Director of Consulting here at the Unstuck Group since 2016. And during that time, she served over 150 churches, helping them design ministry, staffing, and multi-site strategies. So, Amy, how about you? Any stories come to mind of either churches that are aligned or misaligned in their mission?
You know, I think it's true of almost every church that I've worked with in some capacity. And I often follow Tony in these engagements, so he gets to see up close and personal where the actual maybe misalignment to mission sits. But when I follow them in staffing and structure, it's the most common thing I do, which is take a look and remind them again what they're trying to do and get things reordered and realigned so that their structure actually supports where they want to go as a mission. And this last church I worked with, First Church, great church, their big aha, Tony, I know you did the planning with them for multi-site, but the big aha there on this topic was just their invite culture had really softened. And they hadn't really thought about that in a while until we started to go through metrics and start to talk about, you know, where they were compared over last year. And anyways, very, very common discovery.
Yeah. Well, Amy, I wonder if you could just expand some more on why we decided this conversation was the right conversation for today.
Well, sure. You know, after a few years of pushing for attendance and online engagement, basically recovering from our pandemic, right? Churches started telling us that they just no longer have a cohesive sense of being on mission together. You know, we've heard things like this, complaints kind of from pastors that they're boomers, you know, they're watching online, but they're no longer volunteering. They have millennial parents showing up on Sunday, but they're not getting connected beyond that, like in small groups. Maybe students, I don't know, Tony, if you're hearing this, are not inviting friends to participate anymore. And new people just don't seem motivated to start giving or start serving.
Yeah, I'm hearing the same things too, Amy. And I think pastors know their congregation today it's not the same pre-pandemic congregation. I mean, some key families just never came back. Some key volunteers maybe scaled way back as far as their engagement of time. And for many larger churches I'm talking to, what I'm hearing is there's a huge influx of new people who don't have any history with the church, within the church. And that's That's a fun thing. That's a fun transition that's happening, but it also leads to all kinds of opportunities for pastors and church leaders to engage or re-engage people in the mission of the church. So for all those reasons, I think there's just a lack of clarity for pastors on where we go from here.
That's right. And we put this event together today because we hope that you will commit to doing whatever it takes to get your church back on mission together this fall. And we're actually going to walk through this and approach it in 4 really sequential steps. First of all, how to frame up your starting point and frame it up accurately. Secondly, how to create new or freshen up your strategies. The third step, how you can rally and equip your leaders. And then lastly, step 4, some ideas on how you can kind of relaunch going into the fall this year. So we hope that you'll walk away from the conversation today re-energized to really rally your church around a common purpose and grow engagement in all of your key metrics. A few last details before we get into the content today. If you haven't yet downloaded the companion workbook that goes with the conversation, you can get it right now at the unstuckgroup.com/workbook, the unstuckgroup.com/workbook. We'll have members of our Unstuck team that'll be interacting via chat and answering questions today. We don't have time today for a dedicated live Q&A at the end like we often do in our webinars, but we'll try to answer as many questions as we can get throughout the event. So post those questions using the live Q&A button at the bottom of your window. And then, of course, as always, if you want to share on social media, you can do that on Twitter and Facebook. Just use the hashtag UnstuckChurch. And if you're gathered around a conference room table together watching with your team, we'd love it if you could just take a quick picture and share that with us. We'd love to see teams working through this material together. So with that said, let's get into step 1, framing up your starting point and doing that accurately. In step 1, Tony, pastors, they often start to sense that they need to kind of rally the church around a common mission again. So what aspects of ministry health do they really need to have a sense of understanding around first?
Yeah, Sean, I think actually that's critical. Understanding your church's health today is really pivotal to making positive changes to your church. And many pastors, I get it. They want to jump ahead to planning and implementing change, but every church is unique in its history, its vision, the opportunities it currently is facing. And so there's really no one size fits all solution for experiencing health at your church. So before you can make any progress in moving forward, you really need to grasp where you are today. And with that, there are 4 areas that we like to look at that we consider to be essential to accurately framing up your church's current health. Let me go through these pretty quickly here. Number 1 is just to clarify your church's history for the whole team. And the reason I say that is just like there are new people in your church, through the years, you've probably added new people to your staff team, to your leadership team. And by looking back at where your church has come from in recent years, it gets everyone on the same page so that you can look at past successes and past challenges to begin shaping future direction. Secondly, analyzing key data metrics. Sometimes, honestly, our gut is wrong. And this is where metrics can really be helpful, especially if we can take some of that data and benchmark it against where other churches are in this current season of ministry to know where are we healthy and where are there some opportunities for improvement. The third thing that you can look at as you're assessing the overall health of your church is to really unpack that first-time guest experience. So for all the new people that are showing up on Sunday, just getting perspective of what that first-time person is experiencing from the parking lot all the way through the welcome experience, through the worship service itself, and then the follow-up. What are those key first steps, baby steps that we're asking people to take? And then the fourth area that we like to look at is really identifying future opportunities for health. And with that, we like to ask these 4 critical questions. What's healthy right now in our church? Where do we feel like we're stuck? What's just lacking clarity right now? Where is there some confusion about where we are or where we're going in the future? And then what gaps exist or what might be missing? And what we've learned is as we kind of talk through those 4 key questions, as a leadership team, often those will reveal opportunities that we need to be pressing into as churches in order to experience health in our ministry. Through all of this, we want churches to be able to kind of just talk through these 4 checkpoints. And we cover all of these in our Unstuck process. But what we've learned is by going through this intentional process, it really does help get leadership teams on the same page to begin thinking about how we engage our congregation in the mission of the church.
Yeah. And since the health assessment part of what we do is usually a full day in our Unstuck process, we can't really dive into all 4 key areas today. But for just today's conversation, let's get focused on one of them, that analyzing the key data metrics. Amy, what are some of the key metrics you think churches need to be looking at just to better understand their health?
Yeah, well, we use 2 objective assessment tools to help clarify the picture of where a church is today. One of them is to assess where the church is on the life cycle, the Unstuck Church Assessment. Then the other is vital signs. And those are the key metrics that when you look at all of it together, it gives you a much more clear picture of the overall health. Because we talk about this all the time. You can't take any single metric alone and say that it reveals health. But we have found this set of 15 metrics together are pretty compelling. They tell a story. In fact, let me put one up here on the screen for you. This is from one of our churches. And if I had to narrow it down to just a critical few, here's a couple of the ones that I would look at before you start planning. So total in-person attendance change is still an important metric. It's not the metric, but it's one. And we always try to use benchmarks here too, so churches can see how they're comparing with other healthy churches. But I would call total in-person attendance change a lag measure. This is the result of everything that you've been doing. So this tells you, were those strategies successful? But the second one here, new people in the database, I think this is a critical one because I would call this one a lead measure. If you are looking at new people in the database compared to your actual attendance, you really need to see a 2-to-1 ratio there, where we're seeing twice as many people actually get connected with our church than are showing up every Sunday. And I call that one a lead one because if that number is declining, that means your light goal is going to begin to decline too. And then, of course, it's not just about people showing up, but baptism is an important number for us. Percentage of adults and students serving and in groups is important. Percentage of children is important because that's always indicating are we reaching the next generation. But the last one I would call out is this leader ratio, because that's really helping you understand what's our span of care as a church. How many volunteers do we actually have in leadership positions leading in our church? And so the benchmark is 1 to 10, so 1 volunteer leader for every 10 congregants. But man, if you just float those 6, you'd start to get a much clearer look at the health of your church.
Yeah, absolutely. Tony, any other key metrics that you'd like to call out from our vital signs assessment?
Yeah, but before I go there, Sean, I'm just impressed that Amy is starting to call it data rather than data. Did you hear that?
Yeah,
I did. Yeah.
I submit to my leader.
As Amy was talking through that, I think one of the key things that stands out to me in some of the metrics that we look at here is really trying to figure out is the church's staff team the right size, or are we understaffed, or are we overstaffed? And there are a couple of key metrics that we look at related to this. One is taking a look at staff to attendance. And so here we're looking at the full attendance, the total attendance of the church, including kids, and we're comparing that to the number of full-time equivalent staff, all staff, not just ministry staff, but all of the paid staff of the church. And the benchmark we're trying to look for in this season is 75-1, meaning for every 75 people in attendance, there's at least 1 full-time equivalent staff person. So that's one way to kind of look at, are we staffed appropriately? The other is to look at the percentage of the budget spent on staff. And so here we're looking at the full general fund budget and asking how much are we investing in salaries and employee benefits and payroll taxes, all of those staffing expenses. What percentage of our overall budget are we investing for our staff? And again, the benchmark we're looking at here is about 45% to 55% of the overall budget being invested in staff. Now, if anything, we would love for that budget to be less than that range. But I will tell you, when it starts to creep above that range and the staff to attendance ratio confirms that we're overstaffed, that's when we're finding challenges, because for churches that are overstaffed and they're overinvesting in their staff, it really does hamper their ability to invest in moving the mission forward. And so if we're hoping to re-engage our church in the mission, we just need to make sure that we're appropriately staffed for that as well.
Amy, I'll give you the last word on this before we move on to the next section. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think, Tony, you said this when you opened, but I think before engaging in the ministry health assessment, some church leaders are skeptical of its importance because they want to get the work done. They want to jump straight to planning. But afterwards, they always get it. And we like to think of it this way. When you experience some sort of health challenge in your body, a doctor will always do an assessment and run some tests before they recommend a course of action for treatment. So we encourage leaders to think like that same way, a chance to get a clear picture of your church's health before you start to make plans. And by the way, again, I could list several churches, but you talked about, Tony, that gut feel. Sometimes those gut feels are right. But in the health assessment, when you get a team of people, instead of just like a lead pastor and an executive pastor talking about things, when you get a team of 10, 11, 12 people to have those conversations around what's healthy, what's stuck, what's confusing, what's missing. You take these objective assessments and you look at them together. Now you actually have a team that's already aligned with, here, we need to make some changes and here's where we need to go. So it's just an important step.
Okay, before we move on, we'd like to offer you a chance to check your church's vital signs for free. We're giving away free access to our online vital signs assessment to everybody who registered for the event today. So to get your coupon code and instructions, all you have to do is respond yes to the poll that's going to come up on your screen. We'll send that information out after the event. So just take a second to respond to the poll on the screen, and we'll be back with step 2. Okay, let's move on to step 2, and that's clarifying the mission that your church is actually on together. Amy, where do we start here?
Well, based on where you identified health or unhealth in your assessment, that's going to help you zero in on what needs to change and where there's opportunities. In the Unstuck process, we help churches go back to the foundation and answer questions like, why does the church exist? What's our vision for the next season? Who are we trying to reach? How do we define success? What are our core ministry strategies? How do we help people grow as disciples? How do we reach new people? What needs action today? And those are a lot of questions. But honestly, we go through each one of those because they're all important to wrestle with. So to give some timely nuance to those questions for this conversation, a lot of churches right now are asking, how has our mission field changed? And does our reach strategy need to change? So I think we should focus there.
Yeah, that's good. Tony, could you give us kind of a preview of how that mission field and reach strategy conversation need to go?
Absolutely. Because getting your congregation on mission together means giving them a clear understanding of who you're trying to reach as a ministry and how you're going to reach them. You've got to paint that picture for your church, for your staff leadership. That has to be crystal clear. And because of that, we lead churches through some earlier clarifying conversations before they get to this part. But I think these 2 charts will help illustrate the kind of clarity that you need to have about your mission field if you're going to rally people around reaching them. So the first chart I want to share, we call it our mission field chart. And what we're trying to illustrate here is there's a broad mission field that we're trying to reach, but there's this focus on a specific person within that mission field that we want to keep our eyes on, because with that focus, we're going to be more intentional about shaping our worship services, our discipleship strategy, our outreach events, and so on. We're going to be more intentional about shaping how we engage with that person in our mission field with this focus. Then, once we clarify who we're trying to reach within our mission field, we take a look at the second chart, and it's called What's Important to Them. And this is kind of a fun process. I love doing this with teams because we kind of start by brainstorming what are all of the things that are on the mind of the person that we're trying to reach on our mission field. What's really important to them in this season of their lives? And we brainstorm a long list. And then, as you can see on this chart, we try to narrow down to the 5 most important things for the person we're trying to reach. These aren't what's most important, what we think is most important for that person. We're trying to put ourselves in their shoes and identify what's most important to them. And through this conversation, then, we even drill down further by asking not only what's important to them, but what are some of the underlying questions that they are asking related to these 5 top needs. And then we take it a step further and ask ourselves if this is what's most important to the person we're trying to reach, and these are the key questions that they are asking, what are the key questions that we need to be processing as a ministry team so that we can effectively engage these needs and help begin to point people not only to church, but more importantly, to faith in Jesus. And so I love this part of our conversation. It's just fun because many times church staff teams, leadership teams have never gone through a conversation like this in the past. And it's just fun to see the team to come together around this with this focus. For many teams, I think it's the first time they've done this. And with that, there's just always a lot of energy around this conversation, Sean.
Yeah, that's so good, Tony. Amy, can you kind of talk us through where churches go from here after they get clear on who is it that God's called us to reach and what's important to them?
Yeah, and I'll put up another chart here. On this chart, reach and spiritual formation, we consider these 2 of the foundational elements for developing your ministry strategies. On the left there, what are your core reach strategies to reach those people that Tony just described as you go through that exercise? What are the primary ways that we think as a church we can reach them? And some churches, you need to develop them for the first time. Maybe you've never really thought about that. I've shared many times on the podcast. I remember when I realized our weekend service was our main strategy to reach new people. It gave me a whole new lens or a whole new, filter to look through that experience with. Or maybe some of you just need to go, hey, is it time to freshen up the way that we've been trying to reach people in today's context? So that side of it, it's good to get clear perspective on how you're trying to reach people. And then obviously churches can't just stop reaching new people. You have to develop this clear strategy for spiritual formation. And that's another key aspect of rallying your church around the mission. You're going to want to engage the believers in your church on the discipleship path, not so that they get deeper and deeper and deeper in their own personal walk, but that they get deeper in line with your mission to then go and reach new people. So you want both healthy reach and spiritual formation strategies as you re-envision your church.
Absolutely. Tony, before we move on, any final thoughts on this conversation on freshening up strategies?
Yeah, Sean, I'm just reflecting on the early days when I was helping churches years ago. There was a lot of conversation about needing to make sure we have a clear mission statement and a clear vision statement. And there's still value, certainly, to statements like that. But if we're hoping to really engage our church in the mission of the church, I think we have to move beyond kind of the big picture conversation about who we are and where we're going and get a lot more specific. And that's why when we work with churches, we try to help them identify if this is our mission and this is the vision we believe God's given our church, what are just 1 or 2 bold moves that we believe God's calling us to today? And the things that the bold moves we really need to be focused on just in these next 12 months. So this isn't necessarily trying to craft a long-term vision statement, 5 years, 10 years. Instead we're trying to do is help churches identify what's our focus just in this next 12 months. And one good example of this, and I'm just so proud of them, and I love to give shout outs to the Canadian churches that we work with, because we've worked with some great Canadian churches in Montreal and the Toronto area, out in Edmonton. But one of the churches that comes to mind related to this topic of bold moves is onechurch.to. They're located in Toronto. Pastor Jonathan Smith, I mean, he just has a great team that he's built, and it's a great church too. And one of the bold moves that they were focused on was 100,000 acts of love in their community. This is how they wanted to do good in their community and love on people and serve people, not just in their community, but around the world. And they thought if we kind of focus together on this bold move, they thought maybe we can accomplish 100,000 acts of love in 5 years. And so they set out to do that. They created a strategy. They started to cast this vision to their church. And Jonathan just shared with me a couple months ago that what they thought was going to take them 5 years to accomplish, they were actually able to accomplish in less than 2.5 years. And so I think it's just a picture, though, of when you focus on just one or two big, bold moves, it really does help you engage the entire church in that mission. And many times we are able to accomplish far more than we ever anticipated we could because of that alignment around the mission.
Okay, well, let's take just a brief moment here to kind of self-assess. And if you're watching on your own, maybe just write down a couple of thoughts. If you're together with the team, maybe just a quick conversation, and answer the question, in which areas does your church need to develop brand new strategies or freshen up kind of existing strategies that will rally and engage your congregation in the mission? We'll pause just for a quick break, talk about that, and then we'll be back with step 3. All right, so let's move on to step 3, rallying and equipping the leaders in your church. Your team is the most valuable asset you have for getting the church on mission together. And if your staff and leadership isn't aligned around your mission and your strategies, your church probably never will be.
Yeah, Sean, that's just so right. And in many churches, unfortunately, staff exist in silos. And what ends up happening is they kind of define their own wins, their own priorities, their own strategies that they're engaging. And what happens then is that trickles down to the entire congregation as you end up with many different ministries competing for volunteers and financial resources and people's time. And that's why we encourage churches to let one overarching vision for the ministry determine the mission goals and their organizational strategies and the structure of the team. And then once we have that clarity, that helps us then prioritize what we're doing as ministry teams. And importantly, it's also helping us as individuals on the staff team understand where our focus and priorities need to be as well. So with all that in mind, let me share, we call this our strategic alignment pyramid. And I'm not going to talk through all of this, but what we've learned is we need to help teams get alignment in each of these areas in order to get to the place where we're eliminating those ministry silos and the team is actually pulling together. We're locking arms and pulling in the same direction and trying to eliminate that competition for people's time and financial resources and so on. Well, we don't have time to talk through all that's represented here today, but I wanted to highlight how defining your mission, how you make disciples, and the vision for where you're going sets the foundation for every leader on your team to pull in the same direction and then connect everything that they do to the church's overall mission. And here's the great thing. When every leader can connect what they do to the church's mission and vision, every person they lead can be in alignment as well. Let me just give you a picture of how I saw this play out. One of the churches that we were serving a few years ago, again, unfortunately, when we were called in, the church was kind of operating in silos. And what we found is we had to help them clarify their foundation. So who are we as a church and why do we do what we do? And then we had to help them really get alignment around their direction. So in other words, where are we going in the future and how are we going to get there? But when we were able to help them with those key questions, they started to get alignment as a team. They started to get excited again as a team. And this is the good news. Before we started to engage with them, leaders on their team were already talking about splitting into 2 or 3 different churches. But through this process and getting alignment again about who we are, where we're going, and how we're going to get there, that created so much energy, good conversation in the team that it unified the leadership. And through that process, it preserved the church as one church moving forward. So it's just a picture of when we work, and this is hard work, I get it, but when we work at alignment like this and we get the whole leadership team involved in finding clarity on these key questions, it really does help bring the team together, which keeps churches united in mind and purpose. And when that happens, you're bound to see health, and you're bound to then create that engagement in the mission that we're looking for our congregations as well.
So, Amy, beyond equipping the church's existing leaders with the clarity they need to kind of rally people and lead the mission, what are the other key considerations that churches need to make in this step?
Yeah, well, it takes leadership to maintain alignment and rally people. And if you're really committed to leading a church that's on mission together, you also need to take a step back and assess the actual leaders you have now and identify any gaps that exist. We help churches do that through the Unstuck process. We help them identify the leadership capacity of their leaders today. We help them prioritize future hires and develop an organizational structure with clear ministry lanes, healthy span of care, and staff serving in their giftedness. And you may need to restructure to really get aligned around where your church is going. And here's the deal. When I work with teams, they don't spend 2 days with us and then the next week they're taking action on all these things. It's actually a little sobering to take a few steps back and actually evaluate where your structure's at, where we're maybe missing some leaders, where we're missing some strengths, where are the priorities. It actually can be a little overwhelming. But this process usually takes, 6 to 8 weeks, longer for some churches, shorter for others. But it is a process of doing some analysis to step back to get your team healthy. And then we help them clarify the behaviors that make up their culture. And I think culture is a critical thing to address when you're aiming to get the church back on mission together. Because when I work with various churches, it always amazes me how quickly I can pick up on the personality of a team. And while they might have some similarities to other teams I've worked with, there's always unique aspects that make the ethos of that team distinctive. And it makes sense. Organizations tend to be a reflection of their top leaders. And these top leaders, whether intentionally or unintentionally, they're setting the standards by which they desire their team to act and behave, as well as what they want them to value. In essence, that's what we call culture. So we use the culture shaping behaviors exercise to help churches establish or confirm a set of distinct behaviors that define what the team does, how they behave, and what they value. So let me just give you an example. And what was really funny, at least funny to me about this church, is they actually had their values defined, but it was on a table tent and I just picked it up and looked at it and there just wasn't anything distinctive about it. And so I just said, are you all right if we kind of set these aside and go after this version of your values? And 2 hours later, we had a great summary, which I'll show you here, of their values. And the senior pastor, it was hilarious, 2 or 3 times, is like, this is what I'm talking about. This is what we needed, because it finally created that distinctive part of what they were doing. But you can see in these charts, we just have a conversation of a brainstorm around, what are all the possible things that are distinctive. But as I show you this last one, you can see where this team landed. Their behavior is there, and then they give a clarifying statement. And I should disclaim this is a draft right now. They're going to go back and wordsmith this. But if you look at these 5 behaviors, this is who this team is, for sure, after spending 2 days with them. If you are not wired like this, you will not make it on their team. And so now they've got some clarity, not just for their existing staff and what they're championing as a culture, but they know who they're going to bring on their team. It becomes a filter for them. So that church's staff team is now equipped with a clear direction, a clear understanding from the structure work of how their roles work together. They've got a clear understanding of their culture that they're trying to replicate in their volunteer teams and really throughout their congregation.
That's great. Really helpful, Amy. Tony, before we move on, any final thoughts on this section?
Yeah, I'll just add that most churches, I think, approach staffing backwards. In other words, they approach staffing like this. they ask, well, they kind of think people, structure, then strategy. So they ask, who do we have? Then what can they do? And then what can we all accomplish? And we actually advocate for flipping that approach. So let's think first strategy, then structure, then people. So we first ask, what is God calling us to do? And then we ask, what structure gives us the best opportunity to accomplish that? And then who fits in those key roles? And I just think you're always going to limit the bold moves that you're willing to make and the dreams that you're willing to dream for your church and your community if you start with that backwards approach of who do we have on the team and what can they do? So let's flip it. Let's think strategy, structure, then people, rather than people, structure, and strategy.
So as we wrap up step 3 here, let's just take a minute to reflect. And this is the question I want you to kind of kick around. Was your structure formed the first way or the second way? Was it formed people, structure, then strategy, or strategy, then structure, then people? Do you need to shift how you think about it as you dream about how to re-engage your congregation around the mission that God's given you? Take just a second, quick thought about that, and then we'll be back with step 4. Okay, we're moving into the final conversation of today's webinar on re-engaging your church in the mission. And this is the part where the rubber meets the road. What are some of the key questions that churches need to address as they relaunch with this new kind of clarity this fall, Amy?
2 questions that come to mind for me is, how do we improve accountability as we launch into a new plan? And then how do we develop a communication plan throughout our church as we do this restart? Let's talk about accountability. So every action plan needs a system for accountability. And as your church grows, really every individual ministry also needs systems to ensure people are well cared for and that the ball doesn't get dropped. And good systems will keep your strategies on track. Without them, your staff will always drift towards focusing on the urgent over the important. And many of us use task-based systems to keep track of all of our goals and working on them. But let me just give low-hanging fruit again. The best way you can do this if you don't have an accountability plan right now is to get your meeting structure right, especially with your one-on-ones. Because if you do the work of defining what success looks like for your church in this next run, you re-envision your congregation, every ministry knows their goals. The big thing you need to do is just talk about them and monitor them. And if you're a leader or manager, you've got to get roadblocks out of the way and help your teams accomplish what they set out to do. If you don't have good one-on-one meeting structures and you're not talking about priorities, I can guarantee your staff will drift towards other things, especially in church world, that are urgent, not necessarily important. And then the second one is, how do we develop a communications plan? And we have a tool here, our Communicating for Change guide, but this should not be handed off to the communications team. Senior leaders have a key role in the execution of the communication strategy. You have to determine, how are we going to communicate this new mission or this reclarified mission and what we're going to be doing? How do we communicate that to the board? How do we communicate that to the staff? How do we communicate that to some of our key volunteers, our key volunteer leaders? How do we bring them on the inside so they understand why we're doing what we're doing? How do we give that to our volunteers? And then how do we bring that to our congregation? And so you need a plan envisioning and communicating really to each of those groups and determining how you're going to communicate and how frequently. And I say a plan because you're going to want to have a plan before you pull the trigger, because then you can just work that plan and schedule it throughout the year.
Tony, what's another one of those kind of key questions?
Yeah, I think you also have to ask, how do we measure success? How do we make sure that we're engaging the mission the way we're praying and hoping that we will? And are the strategies working? Are we actually seeing the results? So how do we measure success? And I tell churches all the time, there are 2 key things that we need to be looking at. We need to look at the data. So this is going back to the vital signs, making sure that we have targets and benchmarks in place and things that we can actually measure to make sure we're getting the results. And by the way, here, I would encourage you to think about metrics both around reach, so the new people that we're reaching, and around discipleship, the next steps that we're encouraging people to take. So we need the data. But then the second thing we need are the stories. We need to be able to capture stories to make sure that what people are sharing about the change that's happening in their lives, it actually reflects what we're trying to accomplish through our mission. And I always tell pastors, pastors kind of lean one direction or the other. Some lean towards really relying on the numbers. Some lean towards relying on the stories. But we need both, because if we're just a numbers person, sometimes we can make numbers say whatever we want them to say. We just have that gift. So we need to make sure that the stories actually, they agree with the numbers that we're seeing. And then likewise, if we're only listening to the stories, many times it's just the last story that kind of informs our overall impression of where we are as a church. And so we need to make sure that the numbers are confirming the stories that we hear as well. And so when it comes to stories, capturing those stories, first you need to just create space for your staff team to come together and periodically share stories together. But then you need to be intentional about capturing those best stories so that you can share those with your church through social media, through your services. I've seen churches that actually have storytelling teams. So it's a team of volunteers at the church. Their sole responsibility is to capture stories from people in their church, in their community, capture them in writing and video and pictures so that those can be shared with others. And then when it comes to data, I just talked with a church this week. They've repainted an entire wall of their conference room. And on that wall now, they have all of the key metrics that they're tracking in this current season so that everybody knows this is what we're measuring to make sure we're staying on track with the strategies that we're engaging to accomplish our mission. And so I might try to convince that church to take a picture of that so that we can share that with the folks that are watching on the webinar today as well.
All right, Tony, before we close out the last section here, and we've been talking about how we implement some of these changes, you have any wisdom that you can just share with lead pastors specifically on how to move this forward?
Yeah, it's funny, Sean. I'm glad you asked the question because it feels like this is actually a common conversation I'm having with senior pastors. And I get it. I mean, number one, they feel like they're constantly casting vision, both with their staff team and with their congregation, about the mission that the church is on and where the church is going in the future. But I think for a lot of senior pastors, there's a little bit of frustration that just the movement's not happening, or at least it's not happening as fast as they would hope. And so I just had the same conversation with another pastor this morning and sharing with him, as you think about this priority for your ministry, you have to make sure that the strategy is crystal clear and that everybody knows this is the win that we're pursuing right now. Everybody needs to know that. Secondly, this goes back to structure, just making sure that the right structure is in place with the right leader, driving towards whatever those priorities are, whatever those wins are for your ministry. Somebody has to own it. And for larger churches, that can't be the senior pastor. So that's where the structure part that Amy and I talked about a moment ago is so critical. But then when you get to implementation, this section that we're in right now, especially for churches, the challenge is, every Sunday, it's coming every week, every Sunday. And because of that, if we don't have systems and kind of a framework for accountability for follow through, our natural tendency is going to be to focus all of our time and energy on what's most urgent. And as we're talking through this, Sean, I'm just recalling a church I worked with several years ago, big church, big staff team, really all kinds of resources to accomplish their priorities. But even for this church, because Sunday was always coming, ministry doesn't stop. And because they were trying to run after too many things at the same time, boy, I bet they only were able to accomplish about a quarter of what they had identified previously were top priorities. And so for senior pastors, again, it just kind of goes back to, we really need to bring clarity and alignment. I mean, think about that strategic alignment pyramid again. We need to have clarity in all of those layers. We need to have the right structure in place with the right leaders to help drive our priorities forward as a ministry. And we do need to have a framework for accountability. And frankly, sometimes it's helpful for pastors to have an outside voice, to bring some outside of accountability, just to make sure that the team is moving forward with the things that they identified are priorities for the ministry for this season of the church. So, that I think this is a felt need that a lot of senior pastors are experiencing, especially in this season. Hopefully, those are a few thoughts that might help you actually move your mission forward.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so here's one last chance to reflect before we wrap up today. In these areas that we've discussed, just take a few minutes and do kind of a gut check. How prepared are you and your leaders to relaunch this fall? When you think about accountability, communications, measuring success, telling stories, and following through well, how prepared are you? We'll take just a few minutes, self-reflect, and then we'll be right back here to wrap up today's conversation. All right, Tony, Amy, any final thoughts before we wrap up today's webinar?
Yeah, Sean, I was just kind of reflecting back on earlier in the webinar today. I was just mentioning that in a lot of conversations with pastors, they're talking about all the new people that are coming to the church. And so with that, I want to encourage you this Sunday to do this. During your services, ask how many of you are new to the church since the beginning of the pandemic. So, within the last few years, how many of you are brand new to the church, and have all those people stand up. And that visual is going to be powerful. But what it will do is also create an opportunity for you to encourage all those new people with something like this. We're glad you're here, and this is what your next step looks like. And then for those that have been around the church for longer and remain seated, take the opportunity to thank them as well. Thank them for being on mission with you to reach families, to reach their friends. And now here's what your next step looks like. Now, let me just be honest. If you don't have clarity around your mission, if you don't have clarity around your core ministry strategies, and if you don't understand currently what your next bold move looks like, you're not going to have clarity on those next steps that you're going to be encouraging people to take. So if you need help finding that clarity, we would love to come alongside you and help you find that, so that as you invite your church to engage the mission, you're telling them specifically, here's what your next step looks like.
Tony, I love that. And what you just said is so key, because first of all, I feel so honored to sit in the seat I sit in, because I get to see the church across the country. And these relationships that we form, there's conversations that happen for years and years later. And it's just been a great couple of months for me hearing where churches are at that I worked with 2 years ago, 3 years ago, because it's not always that churches have a complete renewal and back to health in 12 months. Sometimes it takes longer because you discover things through the process that you need to work on. But I just heard from a church, my next door neighbor, Wisconsin Faith Community, and they reached out with a few questions, but they just shared they are up. This, again, we started working with them in the middle of the pandemic, and they are up 30% year over year. Their giving is up. Their baptisms have doubled. And it was just such a celebration. And then another church down in Tallahassee I worked with, they had this discipline of every 2 years, they refresh their mission vision, where they're going. And so it was the middle of the pandemic again, but it was time to refresh it. And God just gave them some real clarity about their bold moves. And I had done their secret shopper, and Out of that, they actually committed to redoing
Love that.
their worship center, their auditorium. It needed to be updated. They didn't see it anymore. And they did. They raised money. They did a big renovation. They just sent me pictures of how they reopened it. And again, I think they are now past pre-pandemic numbers and they have a lot of motivation. I'm sorry. They have a lot of momentum, of course, motivation too. But this is really what I hear a lot. So I hope for those of you who are watching today and really considering these questions, it works. It works when we re-envision our congregation, when we bring clarity to those bold moves and we go after it and we actually implement. It's amazing what God begins to do through our church and through the people that show up.
Yeah. And we really hope that you feel after today's conversation re-energized to kind of rally your church around the common purpose and grow the engagement and all of those key metrics that we talked about. So as we wrap up today's conversation, remember, if you've requested access to that vital signs assessment, we'll be sending out the information and the coupon code following today's event. And of course, the replay available of this today's webinar will be available and coming your way very soon as well. So watch for that. And as always, if we can do anything to serve you and your church, please reach out to us today at the unstuckgroup.com. We look forward to seeing you back here on a future webinar. Have a great day.